As I said in the title, Suzume features quite a lot of what I consider to be both the best and worst of anime as a whole, and that's quite an interesting mix. Obviously, I feel that overall it rounded out to a positive given the rating that you'll see later, but to be fair, it's still quite a complex thing to analyse for me. Firstly, I feel the elephant in the room is the absolutely gorgeous, beautiful, ridiculously good animation and art direction. Studio Ghibli is quite rightly regarded as producing many of the best looking animated movies of all time, and having seen several now, I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. As with films I watched in the past like Porco Rosso, Howl's Moving Castle, Spirited Away, and Kiki's Delivery Service, Suzume is an absolute pleasure to behold, and every scene is stunning. I have to admit, were the visuals not at this sublimer level, I might have graded the film a lower rating, but I'm not certain. Either way, I pushed the rating up thanks to how much fun it was to look at, and after all, that's a pretty damn important part of any cinema, animated or not. The various different Japanese landscapes, from the sprawling city of Tokyo to the countrysides and mountains, contrasted with the more fantastical realms outside of Earth, were all a joy to explore with the characters. However, as beautiful as it wasn't as creative or unique in how it utilized its visuals as something I would consider top tier, like Howl's Moving Castle. It's been years since I saw that one, but I can still remember how many of the striking and completely individual elements that the visual storytelling massively enhanced. Here, it's not on that level. It definitely helped the entire experience a lot, but it didn't really have that same impact. And I don't think it's just me being older and harder to impress, or that I've seen more movies to compare to now, as I watched most of the other Studio Ghibli anime that I've seen quite a while ago, and some always stuck out to me more in this aspect than others. I'll give a couple of examples. I always found the tar or goo monster thingies, can't remember the names right now because it's been a long time, really memorably intimidating and unsettling, and not just for their looks. The way they moved, menacingly stalking Sophie and the others, and covering the colour and life of the environments they inhabited. It's like they're a stain upon reality itself, abhorrent abominations that warp and contrast the natural world around them. I was also really struck with how Howl's transformations were presented visually, with amazing shadows and contrasts, top-notch designs, and it really made the tension and fear of what the hell he could look like grip you in a really immersive manner. The sound design was also impeccable, but to be fair, that's a different element. In Suzume, the giant worm was cool looking, especially when fully released and revealed, but beyond that, there wasn't too much. I wasn't particularly intimidated by it after the first appearance when we had no idea what it even was, and it didn't really have a unique character to it. It was just this metaphorical venue for the themes and conflicts the film is building on, and rather than embodying them in its being in every facet, it was just a physical way of getting those across. It worked, but it didn't excel. Likewise, while I understand the tone and narrative intent behind the two were completely different, Howl's physical changes versus those Suta undergoes is a non-contest. It was still compelling and added pressure to the plot in this film, but it never reached any new ground whatsoever in the presentation, and certainly won't stick in my mind like Howl's did. It's not just the tone either, because Howl's were still sometimes presented comedically and more as tantrums than horrifying mutations, and they still lost none of their impact for me. Not to take away from the excellence of the art direction, but I just wanted to point out how it's about more than just looks if you want to get a top score from me. I mentioned sound earlier, and I'll elaborate some here. The soundtrack was mostly solid, with moments of excellence that really strengthened some parts of the film. I'll get some flack for this, I'm sure, but I'm not really a fan of the overly exuberant and upbeat anime intro style songs which crop up in many of them, and I was glad the OST wasn't chock full of that type of song this time around, at least from what we saw in the movie itself, and the couple of exceptions to this were very bearable for me. I don't hate them all, it's just that often that style really isn't for me, and sometimes it's hilariously tonally contrasting to the point of being bathos. As I said though, not a big issue this time around. The sound design was brilliant, but another genre trope that gets to me was certainly present here, that being the hugely overemphasized way that characters react, grunt, and generally make noises vocally. Half the time it's just funny to me, but sometimes it gets on my nerves somewhat. I also don't like how often characters just yell and scream everything much louder than necessary, as despite it being a commendable thing for the performers to pull off as well as they do, it really becomes almost self-parody at points. Not really just for this film, but in general for anime. To touch on the characters, all the performances were great, with Nanoko Hara being convincing as a lead and Hokuto Matsumura being a good companion. I'd say the characters as a whole lack too much nuance or depth, easily slotting comfortably into the anime cliche handbook, but they were still all likable and watchable. I'm not against many of the more standardized elements in storytelling that I've noticed in the anime I've consumed so far, but it's still kind of unavoidably noticeable. I think that I Hate Everything, or AHE as he's known on Letterboxd, made this point pretty concisely in his video on the subject some years ago, which has aged very well in my eyes. For me, it's less of an active detriment to this film and more of a deterrent from anime in general, and while I'm definitely suggesting it's not a prevalent issue every time, because it's not, it's definitely exceptionally commonplace, and I feel like this is undeniable even if you're a huge weeb. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, as one can easily overlook it if they're a big fan of this medium, but for me, it's a bit of a problem sometimes. The story here is intriguing and typically Studio Ghibli, weaving a narrative that would be a completely ridiculous farce if handled wrong, yet in the hands of these experienced masters, it has this charm and a special vibe that you don't get outside of anime like this. It's so culturally entrenched, and I think it's great that anime has spread so expansively outside of Japan without sacrificing any of what makes it so intrinsically identifiable or taming it down too much to appease other markets. Looking at you, Disney, you hypocritical hacks. It really is a hit or miss thing for me though, as some anime concepts draw me in with this perfect balance of absurdity and logic with a heavy dose of being really damn cool, while others are just so bizarre and campy that it puts me off. This time, they certainly don't hold back on the absurdist aspect, but they do it right. The subversion of having the stereotypical schoolgirl falls in love with a hot guy setup only to have him be turned into a child's fucking chair that runs and jumps around is honestly genius, and it's consistently used for genuinely great humour. But also it somehow doesn't undermine the more sincere or emotional moments. How they did that is very impressive. The concept of the doors also sounds kind of lame on paper, just a door that spews out a big red thing that you have to shut and lock with a magic key while saying an incantation that basically doesn't change every time. However, again, they make it work, in no small part thanks to how amazing the whole thing looks, but also because beneath the surface there are really deep and impactful metaphorical layers throughout the film. It's pretty clear to me that the 2011 Japanese tsunami and earthquake tragedy is a huge influence on this, as well as the other natural disasters that have plagued the country, but it has been confirmed that the Tohoku earthquake, sorry if I butchered that, is the deadliest in Japanese history and also a direct influence on the film. It hits pretty hard how they tie this into the film's mythology. It's not exactly subtle, but I do think it's very tasteful and poignant. The narrative is very far from flawless though. For one, I felt the worm was underdeveloped, and I also thought that the cats, or stones, whatever you want to call them, were cool, but much went unexplained, especially when the second one showed up. And as for Daijin, I was very unclear on its motivations. Generally, I feel like the lore and background on things like the closers and the ever after should have been a larger focus. From what we did get, it was pretty damn interesting, and I would have liked to have learned more, but we just didn't really see that. This, along with some of the other things I talked about, is why the film teeters on a lower rating for me, with me mainly wanting to keep it at the one it is, due to the stellar graphical presentation. It's not bad at all, but definitely not a masterpiece. All that being said, I really do think this one is worth seeing in cinema, if nothing else purely for the aesthetic experience, but there is a genuine heart to it. And despite being a more generic, tropey entry into the Studio Ghibli filmography, with many story beats you see in almost every popular anime out there, it definitely has more merits than it does drawbacks, in my opinion. I wouldn't call it an anime or genre staple, but it is a very good watch.